Hi, folks. Welcome to another Dialogos. This is the second installment of our Dialogos live stream. It's currently a work in process, and it's evolving as we go along. And we're currently brainstorming ideas as to how we can make this current format more interactive. One thing we were thinking of doing was opening up the live chat during these discussions, and this would allow audience members to field questions and become active participants in our dialogue. So, um, you know, that's one way we're kind of thinking of running it going forward. We're also possibly just thinking of opening up a live chat and then maybe addressing people's questions more towards the end of our dialogues. So we're kind of just mulling this over and seeing what might suit this type of format best for our intents and purposes going forward. But for tonight, I thought we would continue our conversation where we left off, Ryan, talking about the nature of mysticism and the origins of mystical philosophy. And we'll see where our conversation goes. But maybe even before beginning, it might be useful for our listeners to get refreshed on where we were last time. So, just to offer a brief recap, last time Ryan and I had a chat, we were talking about the origins of mystical philosophy and the nature of mystical philosophy specifically. And one thing we explored was the nature of mystical philosophy. We talked about our personal connections to mysticism. We focused on defining mystical philosophy, and we contrasted mystical and scientific philosophy. And finally, we examined the apparent tension between emotion and reason, and we sought to resolve this tension by examining how emotion and reason are actually integral to one another. So tonight's discussion more or less branches out from this initial conversation we had, and I thought that to open things up, Ryan, we could kind of ponder several key questions. One is, what is mystical philosophy and how is it distinguished from other types of philosophy? That was the initial question we posed last time. Since that last time we chatted, however, I think my own views have evolved and have refined a little bit. Um, so I want to visit those, and I'd be curious to see how your line of thinking has developed since our last chat. And another key question I thought we'd ask tonight is mystical philosophy and rational inquiry mutually opposed or not? Again, that's a question we pondered last time, but I think since last time, my own views again have changed and I think become a little more refined as well. And so I'd be curious to hear what you have to say on that. And then I thought some other questions we could examine are, is mystical philosophy really a distinct category at all, or is it just an undercurrent that runs through all philosophy and science, whether explicitly acknowledged or not? So these are some questions I'm curious about asking and reflecting upon, and I'm curious as to what your own reflections are, Ryan, on these questions. And I'm wondering where we can go with all of this and where we will end up in the end. But in any event, maybe we can pose the initial question, which is, what is mystical philosophy and how is it distinguished from other types of philosophy? So the way I've been thinking about it lately is that one of the distinctive features of mystical philosophy is that it is a way of life, that it's an ethical mode of being. And some of its distinctive characteristics are that it's intuitive, it's kind of a something that is felt, that is experienced, often without any explicit logical reasoning at all. So that points towards the centrality of experience. I think all mystical philosophy, in some sense, is rooted in our direct experiences of things, and therefore, mystical philosophy is not an academic exercise. It's not like proving a theorem. It's it's not merely an activity of thinking about the truth, but it's a way of inhabiting the truth, so to speak. So put differently, it's not about analyzing the universe; it's about merging with the universe. So, so yeah, to kind of hone my own previous view, that these are some other things that have come up for me since then. So I'm just curious as to like what's your take on all of that? How do you define mystical philosophy, and how do you distinguish it from other types of philosophy?
Um, I would agree with the intuitive aspect of mystical philosophy. I think that it is rooted in sort of that direct experience, and what it shows to us, that direct experience, is something that's like immediate. It's not something, like you said, that we have to theorize about or think about. The truth of the matter is right there for us to see in the immediate experience itself. It's like it's built into the experience. And I think that's sort of what is defining of mystical philosophy. And like you said, what it reveals, that truth that it reveals, I think mystical philosophy, what it tries to do is, like you said, you're sort of merging with the truth or aligning yourself with it. I think, as we've talked about, as we will talk about with Pythagoras, and the harmony of the spheres, right? So it's about aligning yourself and harmonizing yourself with the truth that is revealed to you in that direct experience, whatever it is.
Hmm. Yeah, I like how you bring that back to Pythagoras, and I think that's a good example of what we're talking about here. With Pythagoras, um, on the surface of it, he comes across as kind of a prototypical rational philosopher with his emphasis on, the importance of mathematical knowledge to grasping the universe. But for him, it wasn't just merely an intellectual grasping. It was also something that had a deep emotional resonance for him, and such that you could even say he experienced the mathematical order of the universe, not merely thought about it. And you know, perhaps he was entering into sort of meditative states. I know his school of philosophy had you know very structured um, a very structured sort of ethical regimen for conducting themselves, but they had everything from meditative practices to um, you know prayer to abstention from eating animals and beans, and also ritual silence. They did spent a lot of time just in pure silence, going for silent walks or being engaged in silent meditation. And perhaps these were all kind of experiential avenues toward tapping into that mathematical order of the universe, not simply thinking about it, but actually experiencing it as sort of an ordered harmony, that perhaps could be quantified too. And so maybe on the one hand, you have him, Pythagoras and his followers, having this direct experience of the mathematical order and harmony of the universe through these various practices, but also aligning that with reason as well, and coming up with mathematical formulas and such, the Pythagorean theorem. So here we have like a philosopher who's both, it seems to be a emotional oriented philosopher, but also a rationally oriented philosopher as well. Anyways, that's a long-winded digression. Where exactly were we in our line of questioning here?
I think we were kind of moving on into sort of distinguishing it from um, other types of philosophy. So, like, how would you distinguish it, say, from a rationalist, philosopher, like a prototypical rationalist, like Descartes.
Right.
Like would you put them in somewhat of the same camp of philosophies, or would someone like Descartes be far removed from sort of the mystical?
Right. Well, it's interesting that you bring up Descartes because, in thinking about my own thoughts about this, Descartes was one figure who came to mind as someone who, on the surface of it, might seem like a prototypical rational philosopher. But I also feel like, too, Descartes is one who also arrived at his understanding of things through non-rational means. Like I know that, for example, his meditations on first philosophy, I think, a lot of his ideas came out through thought experiments, through imagination, through visions that he had. So in that way, I suppose he wasn't your prototypical rationalist philosopher. If we strictly define that as someone who puts like a heavy reliance on like logical deduction and excludes other ways of knowing, I think that like one of the hallmarks of mysticism, in contrast to just pure rationalism, which places logical deduction and inference and things at the center, is that the mystic has flashes of understanding that aren't reducible to logical syllogisms. The mystic, he doesn't analyze the universe; he merges with the universe, and he might use reason and deduction and so forth, but that might not be his primary way of knowing about things. And yeah, so that's one way I've been thinking about it. And just to
Can I
maybe,
bring up
yeah,
another example?
yeah, go ahead.
So this really reminds me of Wittgenstein and his sort of theories, where there's sort of like this earlier like logical Wittgenstein, but then later this more like mystical Wittgenstein, where you can't really say what two things have in common. Like a definition is by definition false in a weird way, but we use them as conventions and we all know how they're used. And so like you don't need to boil it down into a formula, you just need to know how the things are used in a weird way, to understand mysticism or mystical philosophy. It's not about boiling it down into a theory, as long as you know how to align yourself or merge yourself with it, with the rules. Like you don't need to think about them too much,
Right,
as long as you just kind of know how they're used.
right. Yeah, no, that's a good way of framing it. Wittgenstein's another interesting character to consider in this discussion because, on the surface of it, he seems to be a kind of proto-rational philosopher as well. But I suppose if you dig deeper and examine what he's actually saying in his philosophical writings, there's an underlying, I would even say, not necessarily anti-rational element, but one which an element that recognizes like the limitations to reason and the limitations of analysis and of language itself. And what I recall, especially of like the later Wittgenstein, was his notion that the meaning of any proposition is its use, and that's defined by the social community in which it is used. So you can think of things like the rules for driving a car, um, you know, within a city or within a country or something. There's certain rules people need to follow in order to safely drive. Various things like right of way and obeying speed limits and stopping at intersections and so on and so forth. And we all seem to be able to do this relatively effectively on the whole, with proper instruction and experience and so forth. And we internalize these rules, and then all of a sudden it's easy to align yourself with them and your behavior with them. And uh, this, I suppose, doesn't require too much, rational philosophy, thinking, you know, analytically, or too hard about them. That's just a matter of doing as it is, as much as it is about thinking. If that makes any sense.
Sorry, I muted my mic.
That's okay.
I want to go back to put yourself back into your workplace and try to remember how that place looked, felt, and how you experienced it, like the first time or like that first week you walked in there and worked there. And now that you've aligned yourself with all these rules and conventions of your workplace, how that space is transformed, your experience of the space is transformed. It doesn't even probably feel like the same space as it did the first week. Um, and I think that right there is part of the mystical experience, is being aligned with others in sort of orientation to a set of rules or conventions that sort of gives you an altered state of experience.
Hmm.
It's like if you've ever been in a crowd of people at a concert or at any sort of significant event, you can see how that how that effect takes over.
Yeah, no, I think I can see what you're getting at here. A lot of what you're saying is reminding me actually of Cornford, who we talked about last time, and his sociological framework for understanding mystical philosophy and the origins of mystical philosophy. But one thing that you were saying kind of reminded me of his notion of a collective representation,
Yeah.
and a collective representation according to Cornford, and this is a phrase he gets from the eminent French sociologist Emile Durkheim. Uh,
Mm.
Cornford basically took Durkheim's anthropological ideas that Durkheim was using to study like indigenous cultures and tribes to the ancient Greeks, and to try to understand the origins within that framework. But basically, collective representation is the shared beliefs and symbols that a community holds in common, and they form the foundation for that community's worldview. And according to Durkheim, these collective ideas they shape individuals' perceptions and their experiences, creating a common reality. And in early religious societies, collective representations were centered on sacred symbols, rituals, and beliefs that unified people and provided a sense of shared meaning. Now, taking that concept and kind of applying it to your example, Ryan, you were talking about my current workplace and what it was like when I first started there compared to what it was like compared to say now. There was a lot of, I suppose, rules and things, regulations that I didn't know about. And as I've come to know these things, you know, I've sort of developed this collective representation of what it is to work at my job, and they've kind of sort of formed the foundation for the rest of the work that I do, like just the standard operating procedures and so on and so forth, which are not only apply to me as an individual, but they apply to all of my coworkers. And it's in virtue of that we have this shared understanding and meaning of what it is we're doing at work, I suppose.
It's what unites you guys.
Yeah, yeah, precisely.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm sure you can relate that to what you do for work.
Well, I have moved so many times in my life, and I've lived in so many different places that I've constantly experienced this, where I'm in a new space, and to me, the space looks totally different to everybody else. It has no meaning, there's no order, there's no sense to it because it's new to me. But to everybody else, they exist there. And to them, it's obvious what you do in this space. And to me, it was never obvious. Do you leave the lights on? Do you close the door? Do you leave the door open? I don't know these things. But it all depends on what their collective representation is at the house or at the workplace or whatever. Um, but it's because they're in the cult, right?
Right.
They're already in the cult, so to them it's obvious. They
Right.
see the things that you don't see,
Right.
um, and that's just true for whatever area you specialize in. You know, if you're a landscaper, you're going to see certain things in a
Yeah.
certain way that other people just won't see.
Yeah. Yeah. Precisely. Precisely. I mean, I can relate to that because I have done landscaping in the past. Now I'm working more in the mental health field, helping people with addictions and people struggling with, you know, making 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 ends meet and meeting their daily needs and so forth. And I have a collective representation, I suppose, of what it is that I'm supposed to do to help individuals like that, services I can provide, advocacy, outreach, and so forth, emotional empathy, um, you know, providing them with educational resources or aiding them with whatever knowledge I have as far as how to reduce harm, how to curtail addictions, and so on and so forth. But in any event, we don't necessarily need to focus too much on the specific examples to kind of just get the gist of what we're talking about, which is that the importance of social influences, I suppose, in what are the overarching questions we're thinking about, I suppose, and thinking about I don't know, how do we get down this rabbit hole?
Sorry again. We got down the rabbit hole just talking about mystical philosophy, how it might differ or compare to other philosophers, and then we went down talking about um, how it was important for. Uh, how did we get here?
Well, we're talking about the importance of social factors, I suppose, in
Oh, you right, Cornford. You got onto Cornford.
Cornford, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, in collective representation,
yeah.
and that
So
was
talking
really,
about the workplace, yeah.
yeah, and I was relating that to Wittgenstein and his
Hmm.
notion of meaning and use and social influences and so forth. And I guess that was all coming back down to mysticism as a philosophy that's not it's not anti-rational, but maybe it's not you know it is emotional in nature and it is social in nature, perhaps. Um, you
I
know,
think there might also be elements of mystical philosophy in other types of philosophy. You know, like
mhm,
certain philosophers within other fields of philosophy might have certain mystical elements to them.
mhm,
And I think maybe that's kind of what we were getting at with Descartes and Wittgenstein, who might appear to be, in some other rationalist camp, but when you look closely at them, like they do have some maybe mystical elements to them. Maybe perhaps that's sort of where we were going with that. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. Well, let's rein this back in for a second and kind of maybe reorient and realign with what we were thinking about. So we were talking about this difference between mystical philosophy and how that's distinguished from other types of philosophy. So one thing that came to mind was that the rational philosophers focused on conceptual clarity, focused on refining definitions, eliminating contradictions, building airtight systems. The mystical philosophers focused on embracing paradoxes, maybe more focused on the ineffable, and someone who is perhaps like sort of more Socratic might be concerned with justice by asking us to define justice, whereas a more mystically oriented philosopher would just say be just. And so maybe that's the difference there. Not to say that Socrates wasn't also a mystic, but it's moving just beyond mere interest in definitions to actually embodying what the definition is pointing towards.
Mm. I think
But
that's a really important element to consider just in our daily lives. Like whenever we're trying to teach something to somebody, to like embody the principles which you're trying to espouse. Like, I've been to many a training sessions in my time. People, issuing workplace training, and they're displaying none of the skills that they're trying to teach you while they're administering the training. Like it could be, talking about how you interact with people and, how you present people. Meanwhile, they're slouched in a
yeah,
chair pressing,
yeah,
the keyboard and not
yeah,
looking at you. Um, it just it kind of takes away the validity or the truth that should just shows itself as evident, right? Like this person is clearly an honest person. It's just apparent. They're telling the truth. Like I don't need to do really any more digging. That should show itself forward in their character.
yeah, yeah. Precisely. I think that this is getting towards I suppose the limitations of just defining things and just using reasoning alone, using reasoning alone. But if if you can be if you can like create an alignment between um, what you can articulate rationally and what you can embody um, in your character, I feel like that's where real teachers and real learning comes into play. When you see that alignment between what someone's saying and what they're doing, that congruence. Um, how does this tie back to like mysticism versus rationalism? Well, I think it's getting back to like how mysticism is like a way of being. Um, it's about being a good person and not just thinking about what goodness is. And I can think of teachers, for example, that I've had who have been very compassionate people and kind people, and there's almost like a an atmosphere when you're around that person. Like you can sense their goodness. You feel like comfortable with that person. You feel at ease. You feel their warmth and their friendliness and so forth. And it has nothing to do exactly with what they say, although if they say resonates that energy, that's all good and fine. But it's coming from the core of their being and not merely the words that are coming out of their mouths necessarily, right? And I guess that's
Yeah, it's
pointing
not
again
just
to
the right words, but it's said in the right way.
said in the right way with the right energy, and that's coming from, I think, the core of a person's character and everything that can't be put into words. That ineffable aspect. Um, like I've had like good Tai Chi instructors, for example, in the past, who very little of what they instructed had to do with what they were saying a lot of the time, but just being in their presence and seeing how they embodied the Tai Chi form and so forth is what really helped to transmit the teaching, and which really helped to, which really lent to the experience, I suppose the mystical experience of Tai Chi, because I think you can attain mystical states with Tai Chi, as with you can with other practices, or I don't know if you could say the same, Ryan, about baseball. When you're playing baseball, do you experience anything that's you might consider to be mystical or a mystical experience?
Maybe if somebody slips something in my hamburger or my hot dog in between innings, but
Okay, right.
no, no. I mean, yeah, I can see how can happen in baseball. We get together in a huge sort of like festival type capacity, like once a year, 80, 90 teams, so like over 1,000 people. And yeah, it does kind of give you that greater than you, you're bigger, you're part of something bigger than you kind of feeling. Because you'll have this sort of shared collective representation of what you're here for, It also helps that it's on Canada Day, usually the long weekend, so there's that extra sort of united spirit going on. Um, but yeah, I would say I've had some mystical experiences in those kinds of settings.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can kind of relate to that because I've played sports in the past, like soccer and so forth, and it's always exhilarating when you work together as a team to achieve a goal, like um, scoring a goal or um, making a good play or something along those lines. But it's a sense of being part of something greater than yourself, and it's kind of a shared experience of a team unity or something like that. Um, and yeah, so there's parallels and there's analogies, in various areas of life, not strictly just traditionally religious settings like being at a church or an ashram or so forth. Like I think the mystical experience can occur in a variety of situations, from the more ordinary to the more profound. In any case, I feel like we're digressing a little bit. Maybe we can circle back to where we were headed with all of this. Yeah, well, maybe in the interest of time, Ryan, maybe we can shift on to a few other questions before we wrap up. Let's see how our time's doing here. But I guess one thing on my mind has been is this question of, is mystical philosophy and rational inquiry mutually opposed or not? And we talked about this a little bit last time. Well, I guess these are some of my latest thoughts on it. Let me know what you think here. So I'm thinking that mystical philosophy and rational inquiry, they're not mutually opposed. I think they're very much integrated with one another. And one illustration I thought of was this notion of theoria, which was a notion that Pythagoras kind of ushered into philosophy. But in its original sense, theoria wasn't just about thinking about things. It was contemplation in a deeper sense, a kind of like intellectual vision, if you will. And Pythagoras would embody this by contemplating mathematical truths, and it wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was spiritual. So for him, numbers, they weren't just abstract tools for calculation. They were revealed. They revealed the divine order of reality, and this contemplation in turn wasn't detached from his experience. It had an ecstatic dimension. And so to see the truth of the cosmos was to participate in it. And so I think this is getting maybe again to the contrast between mysticism and rationalism. Let me just elaborate on this a bit more with a bit more examples, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. So think of Pythagoras' music of the spheres. This is a notion where the celestial bodies, they move according to certain numerical harmonies, and it's not just a scientific claim, but it's also a mystical claim. And the philosopher's job in that sense isn't just to know this intellectually, but to attune yourself to it, to live in accordance with that harmony. And so, yeah, I think that theoria is one way to bridge mystical experience and rational inquiry. And I think it suggests that there's a way of knowing that isn't purely deductive, but it isn't purely emotional either. It's a kind of like intellectual ecstasy, if you will. So I'm curious as to your take on that.
I would definitely agree that there is a type of knowledge or knowing that something is the case or that something's true, that's beyond or separate from sort of just that rational or purely, emotional point. There's sort of like a point at which they connect, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are sort of those divine revelation moments where it's just like, aha, yeah, like that makes sense. Like there's no denying that that's the truth. Like I know it intellectually, I know it emotionally, and I know it both ways backwards. It's
Hmm.
just it's almost tautologically true within yourself.
Right.
Um, and yeah, I think that gets back to the truth just being so evident and being intuitively true, being just apparent on the surface. It's like an experience that just hits you like a truck,
Yeah.
and it's like whoa, yeah. That's sort of
Yeah.
how I kind of see it, and then aligning yourself to it. That's sort of what reaffirms it. You have that initial experience. It's like, oh my gosh, like I have to do something. I got to change everything. I got to, you know, turn 180 degrees, about turn,
Yeah.
and start doing something else. And then the evidence that you've done the right thing is again immediate in your experience. It's something that you feel intuitively to be true.
Right.
Um, you can feel it just by how you're doing. I mean, you're no longer stressed out. Things are happening. you know,
Yeah.
um, things just feel easier. You're kind of in that flow state.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I feel like your physiological reactions to the world are good signals as to how if you're living with harmony with the world or not. And I feel like that applies to like that's especially true with regards to the ethical the way that you approach the world ethically. Like Pythagoras pointed towards the importance of respecting all life, and I think that's why his school practiced vegetarianism, right? Because it recognized the interconnection of all beings, and that causing harm to animals, for instance, would have negative consequences for individual human beings because might lead to a corruption of their souls, and then that would carry forward into their future incarnations because Pythagoras and his followers believed in the doctrine of reincarnation. So they thought, the way that you treated people in this lifetime would have an impact on your own being in a future lifetime. And it would have ramifications. It would have moral ramifications. And it would perhaps wouldn't be
The
a,
sins of the father, basically, right? You
yeah.
you do one thing wrong, and that can have ripple effects. Days or years or generations down the road.
Yeah, precisely. It's just in some ways it's just like think of it like as cause and effect. Like what you do has effects, and some of these effects might be of greater significance and magnitude than others, and will have continue to shape your destiny moving forward in life. But in any event, we don't have to digress too much on this.
Can I
Yeah, go
just
ahead.
one more thing there? So it's not purely deductive or rational. It's not purely emotional. There's something that connects it, and I think you already said it. It's the physiological. You can feel it physiologically to be true on sort of that physical basis. You know, on the fact that you're a human being, you
Yeah,
can intuitively sense this to be the truth.
yeah, yeah. It's like it's gnosis versus logos, right? Like gnosis is this mystical notion of this intuitive mode of knowing, right, based upon feeling and direct experience, and then logos is more of this um, cognitive, rational, logical way of knowing things. And I think perhaps um, you know the the best approach is to integrate the two into a unified philosophy. And mysticism and rationalism need not be mutually exclusive. They can be allies for one another. I think Pythagoras is a good example of that. Um, yeah. So in any case, I just thought I would offer those reflections. And unless you have any other things you want to get in there with Ryan. I wanted to maybe, with the time we have remaining, maybe just examine some apparent contradictions, which is that you know if theoria is the key to this integration between reason and emotion, or mysticism and logic, or so forth, then it still seems to prioritize like intellectual contemplation as the highest activity. So you know wouldn't that just merely suggest that rationalist philosophy is or wouldn't it suggest that theoria, in essence, is just like a rationalist philosophy that has mystical overtones? So, or do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a rationalist. It uses rationalist methods for mystical kind of aims or ends.
Right.
Like it's using reason for the purpose of attaining, mystical visions and increasing harmony, right?
Hmm.
So with the increasing harmony, you get, you know, more deeper visions into what is true. And so, like, the more you contemplate, yourself and God, or, the harmony or whatever, the more you can then align yourself with it, and the more you can know, the more, visions and things you can have access to.
Right.
I think that is maybe sort of the difference. There is that there's that aim at continuing sort of that mystical endeavor.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I can see that making sense. Um, I feel like to say that rationality comes first is perhaps too strong. With regards to philosophy, I think the two go hand in hand. Which comes first is, I suppose, is a question that I'm not entirely sure about right now. But I'm thinking of certain examples, and I think that some of the great thinkers and philosophers have shown that reason and emotions are integrated, at least. If you think of like Einstein, for example, um, on the surface, his theories seem to be purely mathematical, right? They're concerned with gravitational equations, space-time curvature, the elegant precision of relativity, and so forth. But if you go back to his personal writings, you find something else entirely. And Einstein talks about how he felt the universe's beauty and order in a profoundly mystical way, and he spoke of a cosmic religious feeling, a sense of awe in the face of nature's hidden harmonies. And he had a famous line. I think it was, "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible." So that reveals something, I think, beyond pure rationalism. And then you have figures like Newton, for example, who was obsessed with alchemy and hidden esoteric truths. And I think he combined mystical intuition with a formal, rational inquiry. And so, like, what does all that tell us? Well, I think it suggests that rational inquiry doesn't always reveal its emotional or mystical foundations in its outward expressions. I think the persona of the scientist, philosopher, or mathematician is often shaped by certain cultural expectations. Like present the facts, be rigorous, eliminate subjectivity, but in private, or in their moments of reflection, that same thinker might experience the very awe and wonder that mystics describe.
Yeah, yeah, and I feel like maybe taking this from a Nietzschean perspective, he says that reason, or the intellect, is just another one of our passions. It's just another one of our drives that are fundamentally tied to our physiological needs, and it's fundamentally something that is not rational.
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
know um so yeah, I think people who, like, even I've been guilty of this myself, in the past, thinking, being a cold hard rationalist, and emotion is completely out of the picture. But the ironic thing is that it's anything but at that moment, right? The moment you say that emotion is, that's probably the thing that you're most emotional about, is convincing people that there's no emotion,
Right. Yeah, I know. It does
right?
seem that emotion does seem to be primitive, and our physiological sensations are primitive, and Nietzsche would agree. And maybe that suggests that there's a certain primacy of emotion and of the felt, messages that our body is giving us at any moment. Maybe rationality kind of is later to the scene, as it were.
I
That
think it
it,
probably evolved to deal with, emotions and other people's emotions, right? Like it's sort of, emotion's the foundation, like that raw, pure emotion, but reason's sort of like the cunning one
yeah,
who pretends it's not emotional but really is.
yeah, for
Is
sure.
pretty sensitive.
Well, you even see in our neurophysiology, right? Like the most ancient parts of our brains, like the brainstem and the inner parts of the brain, the so-called like reptilian brain. These are all concerned with like basic survival, fight, flight, and so forth. And then you have like the cerebral cortex, which, cortex means bark, so it's like the covering of the more primal areas of the brain, that does things like perform logical reasoning and deduction and inference and so forth. So it shows that even in our neurodevelopment, that comes later in the physiological development. But yeah, in any case, that's a whole other discussion on neuroanatomy and neural development and so forth. We don't need to go down necessarily. But how are we doing for time? I'm good for time, but if you want to wrap things up, we can wrap things up.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit tired. I think I can probably wrap it up before I burn out and don't have anything else to say.
Okay, sounds good. There was one other little chunk of stuff that I wanted to talk about, so maybe we can just bookmark that for next time.
Sounds great, yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Sounds good. So, in any case, I guess we can briefly just touch on, some of the tensions we explored. So we've been exploring this tension between emotion and reason, and I think throughout the course of our discussion, we've been coming to some resolutions about showing how these apparent things that seem opposed, emotion and reason, actually are in quite some important ways unified, or at least um, complementary to one another. And we're just thinking about like how this impacts our conception of what mystical philosophy is, and maybe what philosophy is more generally. And so I suppose, if we were to synthesize our insights, um, I think we can identify that reason and emotion are, uh, if not continuous with one another, I think um, mutually compatible at least, and each plays an important role within mystical philosophy. Like if you're thinking about Pythagoras and his notion of theoria, of this contemplation of the universe not being merely just intellectual, but also felt and experienced as well. Um, I think that's a good illustration. So I guess to close the circle, Ryan, um, I think um, reflecting on what we've talked about tonight, I think we've discovered that reason and emotion aren't mutually opposed; that they're mutually inclusive, or mutually supportive, at least. In that, that's important for our mystical, or understanding of mystical and ethical philosophy. Um, we think about things like what it is to be just, but what's equally important is for us simply to be just and to um, embody what it is to be a just person, to think and feel in certain ways, and that's coming back to emotions and so forth, and to mysticism as sort of this way of life, not just merely intellectual exercise or contemplation or elucidation. Um, yeah, so I guess those are some of the key takeaways for me, and then we just kind of refined what we talked about last time. But I think we're developing a somewhat more sophisticated understanding of how emotion and reason line up with each other, the ways in which they're different, and how all of this plays into our understanding of mystical philosophy and maybe philosophy more generally. So, do you have any other takeaways you want to touch on before we wrap up?
No, I think I pretty much said all I needed to say for now.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good. I think this was a pretty deep dive on the subject, and I feel like we're um, delving a bit deeper on these issues, which is good. I think it's showing signs of development of our
Yeah.
ideas,
And we
and
only got lost once.
yeah, only once. It took us a little while to get out of that rabbit hole, but we got
I
back.
got distracted. Somebody kind of came into the room for a moment, so I do apologize for that.
Oh yeah, no, that's all good.
Got a
That's all fine.
little off track.
That's all fine. I think there were a few more things I wanted to talk about with regards to the subject of mysticism and rationalism. So maybe we can briefly touch on those next time we chat, and then maybe we can segue into sort of the main subject we wanted to talk about, which is the origins of mystical philosophy. And a lot of these ideas we've been talking about tonight will play into that. So this has all been kind of good lead up to that. So
What do you call grist for the mill? Is that what you say? Grist for the mill?
grist for the philosophical mill, perhaps. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But in any case, yeah, let's wrap up with that. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. We'll have more of these live, raw, and unfiltered dialogues going forward. So stay tuned for the next one. But in the meantime, just keep philosophizing and be wise. Uh, that's my avuncular advice for the night. So, anyways, talk to you soon. Bye for now.